Pawns. This is going to be a rather long lesson, as well as a tough one, since pawns are by far the most misunderstood piece on the board, and contrary to popular belief, one of the most complex pieces as well, simply due to the extensive considerations and possible situations that can result from their correct or incorrect use. First off, however, tell me something. How often have you heard someone talk about a person as a mere pawn? Someone or something that was completely disposable and without any real value. Oh, that's just a pawn. Well, in chess, that is totally wrong when referring to a pawn. The fact is that pawns, while by far the weakest piece force-wise, are so important that they are actually referenced as one of the 4 basic elements of chess. The 4 elements of chess will be discussed in greater detail in later lessons. I will also introduce exercises to better develop your use and understanding of pawns. While they are often considered completely unimportant by lower-rated players, the pawn is actually an extremely important part of the game. Your entire game absolutely revolves around the proper placement of your pawns. Think of your pawns like your battlements in a war, the walls of your castle, your defensive barrier or fortress against your opponent's onslaught. Designed correctly, a fortress should allow you freedom of movement through it, so you can maneuver in and out at will while simultaneously holding your opponent at bay. Lay out your defenses wrong and the opposite may occur, making it actually more difficult for yourself to maneuver and unfortunately easier for your enemy to penetrate. The very famous old Grandmaster Philidor of the 1800s once stated, "Play the pawns well. They are the soul of chess. It is they which uniquely determine the attack and the defense, and on their good or bad arrangement depends entirely the winning or losing of the game." If anyone ever says to you that pawns are simply not important, or scoffs at the very concept that they may be, just smile and teach that person, through your own mastery of their use, the error of their ways. So let's begin with their basic movements. Pawns always move straight forward up a file. They are not allowed to move backwards, actually being the only piece of the game that cannot move backwards. On its very first move, a pawn may move either 1 or 2 squares. Once it has been moved, however, it is forever limited to moving only a single square at a time. Any piece that is in front of a pawn halts its progress cold. Pawns cannot capture forward, so any piece, either your own or your opponent's, stops their movement in a forward direction. Pawns can threaten or capture an opponent's piece only on a forward diagonal to either side. Any opponent's piece that is on one of the forward diagonal squares may be taken by a pawn. Pawn structure. Your pawn structure is the layout or configuration of all of your pawns. Since pawns are the least mobile of the chess pieces, the pawn structure is relatively static, and thus correct initial configuration of your overall pawn structure largely determines the strategic nature of the game's position thereafter. You should strive to create a solid but flexible pawn structure that works best for you as well as inhibits your opponent. Aspects of a pawn structure include pawn chains. A pawn chain is a sequence of pawns on adjacent files that all protect one another. The base pawn is often referred to as a backward pawn and usually must be defended by a piece. A piece being defined in chess as any piece other than a pawn. This reduces the piece's ability to perform other duties. If the base of a pawn chain falls, it is actually possible to lose the entire pawn chain. Pawn islands. A pawn island is defined as any contiguous group of pawns separated by a file lacking a pawn of your own color. The more pawn islands you have, the weaker the overall solidity of your structure becomes, and the greater the likelihood of more base pawns, which in turn requires the dedication of more pieces to the protection of those pawn islands. Doubled pawns. When 2 pawns are moved onto the same file, the lead pawn actually prohibits the movement of the pawn behind it. This formation is referred to as doubled pawns. Due to this, the rearmost pawn, in chess theory, actually loses half of its force value. It should be noted that doubled pawns are only considered bad by more experienced players when they occur on a file other than the D and the E file. On the center two files, doubled pawns actually can prove beneficial and can usually be resolved later in the game through exchanges. Isolated pawns. A pawn is considered isolated when there are no pawns on the adjacent files that can protect it if required. Such pawns, just like the base of a pawn chain, require the protection of a piece if threatened. If doubled pawns are isolated, they are called double isolated pawns. Stonewalls. A stonewall configuration is a formation that totally blockades a section of the board, effectively stopping all passage for either player in that area. A stonewall across the entire board usually is very devastating and often forces a draw. Passant and Pawn Promotion have been given their own lessons in the next section of Chess Coach. As you can see, pawns are far more complex than they may initially appear, and the general public's understanding of them is that they are unimportant. That is very, very far from the truth. As Philidor noted, they are, in essence, the very soul of chess.